The Tet Offensive, the attack that shocked America. On the night of January 30th, 1968, Vietnam was supposed to be quiet. It was Tet, the Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnamese culture. Families were expected to gather. Soldiers were expected to pause. For many people, it was supposed to be a rare moment when the war stepped back and ordinary life appeared for a few days. But just after midnight, the silence broke. Across South Vietnam, explosions, gunfire, rockets, and sirens erupted almost at the same time. Cities that had been treated as secure were suddenly under attack. Military bases were hit. Provincial capitals were hit. Towns were hit. Even Saigon, the political heart of South Vietnam, was hit. And then came the image that shocked America most. A small Viet Cong sapper team breached the outer wall of the United States Embassy compound in Saigon. Militarily, they did not capture the embassy building. They were eventually killed or captured. But psychologically, the damage was already done. Because if the enemy could reach the embassy, what else had Americans been told that was wrong? For years, American leaders had told the public that progress was being made in Vietnam. The enemy was being weakened. The war was difficult, but manageable. Victory was not here yet, but it was supposedly getting closer. Then, during Tet, the enemy appeared everywhere. This is the story of the Tet Offensive, the attack that shocked America, changed the public perception of the Vietnam War, and revealed that a battlefield victory could still become a political disaster. To understand why Tet mattered so much, you have to understand what the war looked like before it happened. By late 1967, the United States had hundreds of thousands of troops in Vietnam. American commanders used helicopters, artillery, air power, patrols, and search-and-destroy missions to hunt communist forces across the countryside. On paper, the numbers often looked positive. Enemy casualties were reported, operations were launched, villages were searched, bases were defended. American firepower seemed overwhelming. General William Westmoreland, the American commander in Vietnam, argued that the enemy was suffering badly. In Washington, officials tried to convince the public that there was light at the end of the tunnel. But the war did not feel that way on the ground. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army did not need to control every city all the time. They did not need to defeat every American unit in a conventional battle. They needed to survive, adapt, and prove that the United States could not create lasting security. That is what made Tet so dangerous. It was not designed only as a military attack. It was also a political and psychological gamble. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong hoped that a massive uprising might weaken the South Vietnamese government, inspire support inside South Vietnam, and convince Americans that the war could not be won at an acceptable cost. They chose the moment carefully. Tet was a holiday. Many South Vietnamese soldiers were on leave. The mood was relaxed compared to normal wartime conditions. A temporary holiday pause made the attack more surprising. Then the offensive began. Communist forces struck across South Vietnam in a wave of coordinated attacks. Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, Con Tho, Nha Trang, and many other cities and towns were hit. American and South Vietnamese bases came under attack. Police stations, government buildings, radio stations, and military compounds became targets. The scale was the point. Even where the attacks failed, they created a question that could not be ignored. If the enemy was close to defeat, how could it attack so many places at once? In Saigon, the shock was immediate. The U.S. Embassy attack became the symbol. A small group of Viet Cong sappers blasted their way into the compound. They did not take the embassy itself, but for several hours, the very center of American power in South Vietnam looked vulnerable. For television viewers back in the United States, that mattered more than the military details. The embassy was not just a building, it was a message. It represented American confidence, American presence, American control. And now Americans saw that even this place could be reached. But Saigon was only one part of the offensive. The bloodiest and most haunting battle happened in Hue. Hue was the old imperial capital of Vietnam, a city of history, temples, walls, and symbolic importance. During the Tet Offensive, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces seized much of the city. For weeks, American Marines, South Vietnamese troops, and communist forces fought street by street and building by building. This was not the jungle war Americans imagined. It was urban combat. Walls, Alleys, courtyards, houses, schools, and government buildings became battle spaces. The fighting was slow, destructive, and brutal. Air power and artillery could help, but in a city, every shell also risked destroying the place being fought over. Hue showed another terrifying lesson of Tet. The enemy could enter major cities, and once inside, removing them was not simple. When the city was finally retaken, the cost was enormous. Large parts of Hue were damaged. Soldiers and civilians suffered heavily, and the images of the battle made the war look more intense, not less. At the same time, another drama was unfolding near the demilitarized zone, Saigon. Before Tet, American leaders had focused heavily on the siege of the Marine base at Saigon. Some feared it could become another Dien Bien Phu, the French defeat in 1954 that had changed the course of Vietnam's earlier war. But while American attention fixed on Saigon, attacks exploded across the country. That created another unsettling question. Or had it helped draw attention away from the coming offensive? For American commanders, Tet was eventually described as a military defeat for the Communists, and in many ways, that was true. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces suffered enormous losses. They did not hold most of the cities they attacked. The hoped-for general uprising did not happen on the scale they wanted. US and South Vietnamese forces retook lost ground. But this is where Tet becomes one of the most important lessons in modern war. A side can lose tactically and still win strategically. The Communist forces failed to spark a nationwide collapse of South Vietnam, but they succeeded in breaking the story America had been telling itself. Before Tet, the official message had been progress. After Tet, many Americans asked, progress toward what? If the enemy was being defeated, why could it launch such a massive offensive? If South Vietnam was becoming secure, why were its cities under attack? If American strategy was working, why did the war suddenly look larger than ever? Television made those questions harder to avoid. Vietnam was often called the first television war. Nightly news brought images of fighting into American living rooms. The Tet Offensive turned distant claims into visible contradiction. Burning streets, soldiers under fire, civilians fleeing, embassy walls breached, Hue in ruins. For viewers at home, these images did not look like victory. They looked like a war that had no clear ending. This is why Tet hit the American public so hard. It exposed the credibility gap, the distance between what officials said and what people saw. Military leaders could explain that the attacks had been repelled. They could explain that enemy casualties were high. They could explain that communist objectives had not fully succeeded. But the public had seen something else. They had seen that the enemy was still capable of coordinated action across the country. They had seen that American power could not guarantee security. They had seen that the war was not almost over. And in politics, perception can become reality. After Tet, President Lyndon B. Johnson faced a crisis of confidence. The war had already divided the United States. Anti-war protests had grown. Families were losing sons. Billions of dollars were being spent. The draft was pulling young men into a conflict many did not understand. Tet did not create all of those doubts, but it made them explode. In March 1968, Johnson announced that the United States would limit bombing in North Vietnam and seek a path toward negotiations. At the end of the same speech, he shocked the country by declaring that he would not seek another term as president. That moment showed how deeply Vietnam had damaged American politics. A battlefield thousands of miles away had reached the White House. But Tet also changed the war inside Vietnam. For the Viet Cong, the offensive was devastating. Many experienced fighters were killed. In the years that followed, the North Vietnamese army would play an even larger role in the war, while the Viet Cong's strength in the south was badly damaged. For the United States and South Vietnam, the offensive led to renewed security efforts and counterattacks. But the deeper confidence had been shaken. The question was no longer only, can America win battles? The question became, what does winning even mean? If a village is cleared today but contested tomorrow, is that victory? If an enemy unit is destroyed but the enemy returns next month, is that progress? If the battlefield numbers look good but public trust collapses, who is actually winning? Tet forced those questions into the open. That is why the Tet Offensive is often misunderstood. It was not a simple military victory for one side and defeat for the other. It was both. Militarily, communist forces paid a terrible price and failed to hold most of their targets. Psychologically, they shattered the idea that the war was under control. Politically, they changed the conversation in America. Strategically, they proved that the weaker side did not need to defeat the stronger side everywhere. It only needed to convince the stronger side that victory would cost too much, last too long, and remain too uncertain. That was the real shock of Tet. The attack did not show that America lacked firepower. It showed that firepower could not solve the central problem. The United States could win battles, retake cities, kill enemy troops, and protect key installations. But it could not easily create a stable political reality in South Vietnam. And without that, each victory could feel temporary. Tet was the moment when the war escaped the battlefield. It entered American homes. It entered the presidential campaign. It entered newspapers, television screens, college campuses, churches, dinner tables, and military planning rooms. The question was no longer hidden in the jungle. It was now in front of everyone. How do you win a war when the enemy can lose the battle and still change the future? That is why the Tet Offensive shocked America. Not because the United States was defeated in the streets of Saigon or Hue, but because the offensive made millions of Americans wonder whether victory in Vietnam was possible at all. By the time the smoke cleared, the maps could be redrawn. Cities could be retaken, reports could be written, casualties could be counted. But something had changed that could not be easily repaired. The story of the war had broken, and once that story broke, the war would never look the same again.